Well, hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. Now, the ninth annual Human Freedom Index, or the HFI, was released last month by authors from the Cato Institute here in the States and the Fraser Institute in Canada. Now, the Human Freedom Index is the most comprehensive freedom index so far created for a globally meaningful set of countries and jurisdiction, and it represents about 99% of the world's population. So joining me today to take a look at the most recent HFI is Fred McMahon. Mr. McMahon is an economist and a Fraser Institute Resident Fellow. Fred McMahon, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you for the invitation.
You bet. Well, let's go ahead and start out with an overview of the Human Freedom Index. What's its history and purpose? What causes all you economists to get together and spend all this time putting all this data together?
Well, first off, as you said in your introduction, we believe it is the most comprehensive measure of human freedom. We'd had measures of freedom that excluded economic freedom from places like Freedom House and a number of others, but they didn't measure economic freedom. We also had, thanks to the Fraser Institute, a number of economic freedom indexes. But the fact is, other freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of association are directly tied to economic freedom. If crony capitalists or an overpowerful government controls your economic fate, they have plenty of levers to pressure you whichever way they wish. Also, we spend a good part, maybe even the majority of our waking hours working. Our jobs are part of our identity, or our entrepreneurship is part of our identity. If that freedom is shut off, then freedom is reduced. So the first thing is to make it comprehensive. We combined economic freedom and other personal freedoms. We have one other innovation that's quite important. Most indexes will measure freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, all essential freedoms, but they usually don't look at security. If I'm in danger of being kidnapped when I walk out of my home, or shot, killed, then my freedom is obviously reduced. So we look at the security situation, number of murders, terrorist attacks, and so on. And also about the rule of law. If you cannot get your freedom protected by a justice system fair to all, then you don't really have freedom either. So we have the innovation of expanding it to all key aspects of human freedom, and of looking at economic and personal freedom, and looking at necessary conditions for freedom.
So things like the rule of law and security and freedom of religion, you kind of lump that in with the personal freedom then?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
But we have two measures of the rule of law, one for economic freedom and one for personal freedom.
Right. Okay, and actually we're going to get into that right now a little bit. Fred, the index looks at a number of indicators to evaluate these two broad categories, personal and economic freedom. Can you discuss these indicators in a little more detail?
Sure. The essential part of the indicators is that we don't produce any of them. Some people cross their eyes and say, what, you don't produce that? Well, there's a very important reason why we go to third-party sources. Everybody has their own prejudices that they probably aren't conscious of. So to make the index as objective as possible, we take measures only from third-party sources and a multitude of third-party sources. So if there are prejudices, they will tend to cancel out a well-known statistical property. So that's the key thing to remember. We use sources such as the Economist intelligence unit, the World Competitiveness Report, various indexes of legal reliability. So a whole range of things.
So one thing I did notice that in the index as a category was abortion. How did you and your um, um, fellow researchers decide that that didn't fit into the whole thing as personal freedom?
That was a difficult question for us. And um, personally, I favor a woman's right to choose. I think most of us in the circle would have favored a woman's right to choose. But there is the other side of the argument, which makes this an ambiguous case. And we try to only deal with clear-cut cases.
Yeah, fair enough. um, Now, my next question may seem obvious, but I really want to hear your answer. Why is human freedom important?
Human freedom is important for two key reasons. The first is that it's a right, that it's something that should go with the human condition. We should have the ability as individuals to control our fate, to do what we wish. The other important thing is outcomes, both economic freedom in particular, but human freedom too, are associated with any number of positive outcomes: lower rates of poverty, higher rates of prosperity, more education, longer lives, healthcare, and so on. That's because the drive and ingenuity of individuals, both in the personal and the economic sphere, uh, just create real advances, which neither the greed of crony capitalists or overpowerful government dominating personal and economic spheres um, can compete with. So the outcomes are immensely positive, the higher level of freedom. And let me say one more thing. You often hear people on the other side of the street, folks who don't like free markets, say, okay, we get it. Yeah. Maybe free markets create more prosperity. Maybe they even reduce poverty. But how could anybody be happy in a dog eat dog, free market, capitalist world? And what we're concerned about with is happiness. Well, sociologists are not known for the friendliness to markets or free markets, but their research shows that one of the real drivers of human happiness is economic freedom, and freedom in general, but specifically economic freedom. People are happier when they're in charge of their own lives. So it's quite a remarkable outcome. There's only one other factor that they could link uh, in the way of causation to happiness. And I'm afraid I'm having a mental blank. I think it might be health, but there are only two factors that this research found made people happier.
Okay, let's go ahead and look at some specific countries now. And I would really want to start out with the two countries we live in, the US and Canada. And I personally would think a lot of them, I don't think this, but I think a lot of Americans would be surprised that the US stands only at 17 out of the 165 countries you have on the list. And is tied with the UK, which I don't always consider the freest of countries. Uh, and I looked at some of the numbers, and economically, I think the U.S. is ranked fifth, but personal freedom is way down at a dismal 27. Um, Fred, what, in your view and in the view of the index, how is the U.S. really lagging in human freedom?
Okay, well, let me give one temporary factor. Both Canada and the United States took a hit on personal freedom of movement during the COVID era,
Mhm.
and a heavier hit than most other countries. So we're down because of that. I assume that we're going to pop back up. By the way, that's not a value statement about the value of COVID lockdowns. We're economists, not epidemiologists. So whether the lockdown saved millions of lives or saved no one, we can't tell. We can only measure its impact on freedom. The United States and Canada, to a lesser extent, tend to have problems with the rule of law. Not deep problems. We're still better than most of the world, but compared to some of the top ranked nations, particularly the Scandinavian nations, they generate greater faith in the fairness of the system and the timeliness of the system. I think both of us are aware of the flaws in the rule of law in both our nations. So that's the key area where Canada and the United States lag behind the top flight nations. In the United States, there's also a bit of a push downward on religious freedom. Much of these are international polls, so that may simply reflect a prejudice. Data is never a sharp point. It's always a fuzzy smudge. But if you had to look at it specifically, it's the rule of law.
Okay. And just for the audience, if you were curious, Canada ranked 13th overall. And I think Fred already kind of covered where Canada is lagging also. Switzerland, New Zealand, Denmark, Ireland, Estonia, and Sweden, 6 countries, but they round out the top 5. The latter 2 are tied for 5th. What similarities do you see that put them at the top? And they seem to be toward the top most years.
Well, actually, they are quite different nations. They get quite different scores. They're in any particular area, they'd all be top 20. But the Nordic nations typically do very well on personal freedoms and tolerance, better than the non-Nordic nations. But then the Nordic nations tend to do poorly on size of government, but they do great on regulation. They're extremely free and open markets, do great on trade. Let me back up a moment. Do better on regulation and trade than Canada and the United States do, but they're way down on big government. So it varies all over the place. Switzerland, interestingly, of the advanced nations, probably has the highest score on size of government, though Ireland might compete. So it's all over the place. The secret sauce to getting in the top 10 is to be good in everything and excellent in some things. But no nation was excellent in all things, with the exception until recently of Hong Kong.
And we're going to get to that in a moment. I'm going to ask you to bring out your crystal ball now. There's been a lot of news about what happened in Argentina in the past couple months, right? And according to the latest HFI, they ranked 38th for personal freedom, but 158 out of 165 for economic freedom. We know Argentina has been an economic mess for quite some time. So now they've elected this libertarian type president who already is putting a lot of government on the chopping block. Fred, do you foresee big changes in the HFI for Argentina in the coming years?
By the way, I just got back from Argentina a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, yeah.
Argentina is an anomaly. There's almost no country, well, there is no country that rates that low in economic freedom and yet has a relatively good score in personal freedom. The two tend to go together. This is a huge anomaly. The new president, as you said, has already run into big troubles. For the Supreme Court, as you probably know, has rolled back his labor reforms. Nothing could be more important, or few things could be as important for Argentina moving forward as labor market reforms. They keep the poorest and the most dispossessed out of the labor market, feed union coffers. It's just an awful system. The Supreme Court has pushed that away. Milei himself, wisely, I think, seems to have backed off from using the US dollar. The reason I say wisely is that Argentina has been pegged to the dollar before. It was a disaster. There's just not the political discipline in Argentina to peg to the dollar. And Milei, in his more recent comments, is recognizing that. He hasn't taken it off the table, but he's recognized that a lot of other institutional factors have to be in place for that to work. There are two other challenges that are not often reported on. The first is simple expertise. Free market revolutions are not a lone man affair. Ronald Reagan had the greatest economic minds, political, well, the greatest brain trust one could imagine. Margaret Thatcher, when she went that route, had Lord Harris, the EIA. Hayek was alive and advising her. Friedman was around. When Chile did it, and we may not like how Chile got there, they imported a plane load of experts from the University of Chicago. I know some of them. Not many are alive left yet. So Milei, he doesn't have those intellectual resources to call on. We tend to think of free markets as a relatively simple thing, and in concept they are. Lower taxes, get rid of regulation, a fair rule of law. But to use an old cliche, the devil is in the details, and if you can't work out the details, the grand scheme doesn't work. The other big problem facing him is lack of institutional support. So when Ronald Reagan became president, he had the Republican Party and the huge resources of the Republican Party behind him. Margaret Thatcher in England, Pinochet, whatever you think of him, had all the institutions in Chile. So there's no real, his party, new party, did better than expected, but it's in the minority. He has no real institutional backing. So he has, I believe, taken the right tack, but his challenges are immense. And then there's the security situation. When I was down in Argentina, I had dinner with a former defense minister who was once a credible presidential candidate, and he was saying that the biggest challenge, in his view, would be the defense thing, and he was hoping that Milei would appoint Patricia Bullrich, who actually ran against him for president and was security minister under the Peronese. He was saying he would appoint her security minister because she was very good and tough, and he has. So maybe that'll work out.
But you did mention Chile, and that was another thing I got out of the report. If you look at the Latin American countries, Chile is head and shoulders above all of them. So something is working there.
It is, but they're in a mess politically. They have a very unpopular, very left-wing president. They've rejected two new constitutions, one that was probably far left and the other that was far right. And they can't seem to settle on an appropriate middle. Chile faces huge challenges. We did some studies using the World Values Survey and the European Barometer, which measure public sentiment, and looked at the questions that indicated whether people were friendly or opposed to free markets. And Chile has one of the lowest approval rates of free markets in the world. So they're fighting a headwind. Chile went from one of the poorer nations in Latin America to, on a per person basis, the richest. Poverty declined dramatically. People got jobs. And that it has not been well communicated to the Chilean people that that's due to free markets.
What's stopping Malay from getting some of the brain trust in free market economics here in the States or the Fraser Institute to assist him in this process?
Well, hopefully he will do that.
Yeah.
And I think there'd certainly be people in North America who'd be delighted to help out. I'm not aware that he's really done that sort of outreach yet. Now, maybe I'm just behind the news on something, but I've not heard of it. I've not heard of any rumors of it. And he tends to be, as you know, a loner. So hopefully he will take your advice.
Yeah, there's plenty of brilliant minds on those topics right here in the States. Let's get back to the HFI. We drifted a little bit here. And the biggest topic, by far the biggest story in the latest HFI is clearly Hong Kong. Let me go ahead and put that up there. Hopefully the audience can read it. As recently as 2010, Hong Kong was the third freest jurisdiction on earth. Today, 46. Fred, what happened to Hong Kong?
Well, let me make a footnote first. What we measure is human freedom or freedoms, not democracy. People in Hong Kong had an incredible level of freedom without democracy. Well, Russians with democracy, before Putin completely distorted it, had much lower level of freedom. So democracy is a system of government. Freedom is what you're able to do without government interference. That's why Hong Kong was so high. Hong Kong, I took a look from 2011 to 2021, which is the most recent comprehensive data we have. And I think it was only that Hong Kong didn't have the largest fall. It had the third largest fall. But it tells you something about Hong Kong when you know who had greater falls, Nicaragua and Myanmar. So, both under now brutal dictatorships.
Right.
Obviously, what happened was the Chinese takeover, suppression, just about everywhere. Now, they are trying to maintain their level of economic freedom. So the suppression is religious freedom of speech, assembly, media, but they are trying to maintain their economic freedom. I don't think they're going to be able to do it. I think you need a whole wraparound freedom to be sustainably high. Now, Singapore has moved into first place, and of course, they aren't perfectly free either, but it's nothing like the suppression that's happening in Hong Kong. This is the first time we have retrospective measurements going back to 1970. And this is the first time Hong Kong is not in first place.
Yeah. I mean, they've been notoriously high along with Singapore. Now, if things in Southeast Asia take a turn for the worst, do we see the same thing happen with Taiwan?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Except it's hard to describe how much worse it would be than for Hong Kong. The mainland, and this is still a bit of a mystery, but the mainland managed to co-opt the police in Hong Kong, much to the surprise of the demonstrators. There was long talk about infiltration and so on, but no, it was the Hong Kong police. The reason I mention that is that the mainland didn't have to fire missiles into downtown Hong Kong or send the army in or completely destroy the infrastructure. Taiwan will fight. Nobody knows how hard, but the destruction and the suppression following something like that it would just dwarf the tragedy that's Hong Kong, and Hong Kong's a big tragedy.
Yeah, it certainly is. Now there's more than 165 countries in the world, so there's a handful that are not represented in the HFI. For example, the one I was looking for was North Korea. I expected them to be like 000, and but is this because there's no data that exists for North Korea?
Yeah, and we don't have Cuba either. I
Yeah,
mean,
Cuba. Yeah,
somebody who claims they have measurements of anything reliable from North Korea or Cuba is taking psychedelic drugs or has an excellent medium. I mean, they're just making it up. I mean, that's what they're doing. If they have North Korea in the index and a number associated with North Korea, it's poof, it's not there.
yeah.
I think we can reliably count on North Korea to have very lousy scores, but to try to pretend you have a precise number for that.
Yeah, yeah. All right. There's a whole lot of stuff we could talk about, but in the interest of time, I want to let you go. And I want to just give you the chance right now, Fred, to elaborate on anything that you think is really important, something we may not have covered. You have the floor, sir.
Okay, well, I'll just mention one thing. There's been a lot of discussion about freedom waves. I'm having a mental blank, but a very, very famous philosopher came up with the idea of freedom waves, and we've gone through 3 or 4, depending on how you measure. Much increase after the First World War, greater increase after the Second World War, and of course, a huge increase when the Iron Curtain fell. Now, each of them are waves because after the First World War, there was retrenchment. After the Second World War, there was retrenchment. And clearly, we're seeing retrenchment now. Hopefully, the news is not as bad as it appears, because after each of those waves, even once things had settled down, there was still a higher level of overall freedom than before. So there are more free countries now than there were before the fall of communism. There are fewer than there were, a couple of years after the fall of communism. Hungary is not a free nation anymore. Poland looked over the abscess and, has crawled its way back. But after each rollback, there's still more than there were before.
Let me go ahead and bring up the actual index so people can see what it looks like. And there we are. That's the Human Freedom Index 2023. And I'll go ahead and link to this in the show notes for viewers and listeners that want to check it out. It's a fascinating read. I encourage you to take a look at it. And I want to thank you, Fred McMahon, for joining me today and sharing your knowledge and discussing the index. And really appreciate your time, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Robert, for your interest in this.